Alright guys, so day X is coming and the financial apocalypse is nearing. While the whole world is focused on Trump's tariff war, we need to talk about what Russia is doing today. For over 2 years, we have said the world is decoupling. The West and the East, they can't reconcile. And this economic clash is only going to get worse. On one side, we have the US and their dependents. And on the other, we have the Russia-China bloc. Putin is now starting to take over what Western companies are left in Russia. He's doing an asset decoupling, taking valuable companies and integrating them into his economy. ING, a Dutch bank, has been finally allowed to exit Russia. Yes, Putin has allowed the EU bank to leave, but they have to sell their Russian business to a local company in Moscow. Now, no one knows how much the Russian investor paid for ING's business, but one can assume he probably got a pretty good deal. The Kremlin definitely had a hand in this, and it confirms the threat Putin gave a year ago. If you take our frozen reserves, we will take your company stuck in Russia. We will either seize them or make them sell their assets at very favorable prices to Russian businesses. As a result of the sale to Russia, ING Bank is going to book a 700 million euro loss. It's a big hit to their profits, almost a billion US dollars worth. But there are still other Western banks and lenders in the country. Let's not forget about that. We have Austria's Raiffeisen Bank. Russia recently seized 2 billion of their assets, so they are getting squeezed dry. Italy's UniCredit could be next in line. There are tens of billions at the minimum that Russia can reach in and take. Christmas for Putin isn't over. The retaliation is far from over. Now, an obvious move Trump could do is to put forward the Russian assets as a bargaining chip. Now, as part of the negotiations, 300 billion by all measures is a huge sum of money to any country. But it seems Trump is now taking a hard line with Russia.
Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
And do you think that the war should be frozen currently along
The
the
war
front
should have
battle
never
lines?
started. If you had a competent president, which you didn't, the war wouldn't have happened. The war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president.
And if we look deeper into what Trump has pledged, it's quite obvious he's operating from a script. Like there's some established foreign policy agenda that even he can't escape. Now, Trump wants to make a deal with Vladimir Putin. And if it doesn't happen, the US is going to sanction Russia again. He will slap tariffs on Russian exports going into the United States. But this part is extra scary. And various other participating countries, which means Trump might target Russia's trading partners. Obviously, India and China comes to mind. They buy a ton of Russian oil. And if you're Russia and you see what's happening, you have to prepare for the worst. In the case of your frozen assets, the smart move is to assume every single dollar is gone. Russia's 300 billion of frozen assets is more or less going to disappear. There's a snowball's chance in hell that it will be returned, and it's likely not going to happen. The rhetoric from the West, especially the EU, is crystal clear. The money will either be given directly to Ukraine or in a roundabout way through the bond markets.
Last month in Kyiv, I announced that we will provide up to 35 billion euros in loans to Ukraine as part of the $50 billion pledged by the G7. This loan will be repaid by the windfall profits of immobilized Russian assets, and it will flow directly into Ukraine's national budget. So, we are making Russia pay for the damage it caused, and we will stand with Ukraine through this winter and for as long as it takes.
And that's why we are seeing Putin making moves on Western assets now. If the money isn't part of the peace deal, it means it'll never come back. So better to divvy up the EU and US companies today stuck in Russia. In another forced sale, Putin has allowed US backing giant Goldman Sachs to sell their Russian business. This time it's being sold to an Armenian investment fund. Now one can assume that the group got themselves a very sweet deal as well, and Goldman probably had to take a write down. Now there are reports circulating that Russia is now drafting laws to directly seize Western assets. And this directly follows Putin's decree for tit-for-tat retaliation against the G7 confiscation. So just how much money is at risk? Well, it's actually quite a lot. There's a total of nearly $200 billion in foreign assets, of which 32 billion comes from US companies, while EU firms accounts for 90 billion. And most of the current actions are either through regulations like taxes, fines from court orders, or pressuring companies to sell on the cheap. But going forward, we could see Russia throw caution to the wind and just outright seize them. Obviously, this is going to scare Western companies away from Russia for a very long time. We are talking about years even after a peace settlement comes. The level of distrust is just too deep. In the next few years, despite Donald Trump, we'll see Russia move closer to China. Now, the sanctions have shown Putin that cutting trade with the West did not collapse their economy. In fact, Russia's GDP growth is going to exceed the EU, which tells us how badly things are backfiring. Russia's tax revenues are back to the pre-war levels, well above 11 trillion rubles. Despite the oil price caps and curbs, revenues for oil and gas is rising and they are staying constant. The ruble falling also isn't a big problem. It actually increases revenue because oil markets in the world they are priced in dollars. And thanks to Trump's tariff war with Canada, oil prices are gonna rise. Remember, he imposed a 10% additional tariff on Canadian crude imports. So indirectly, Russian revenues is gonna soar even higher. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of Putin, you'll suddenly realize who has the advantage here. There's no need to proactively restore trade with the West. I mean, if it comes, that's great. But if it doesn't, it'll be business as usual. It'll just be another Tuesday afternoon. Now, what's really concerning for the West is not just Russia earning revenue, it's how Russia uses their huge oil exports to push aside Western currencies. For over a year, the G7 has been squeezing Chinese banks to stop giving loans to Russia, to stop the flow of Chinese currency flowing into the Russian economy. But Russia has managed to find workarounds to access as much yuan as they need. The cost to borrow the Chinese currency is now stable without any penalty. In other words, Western sanctions have failed. Russia is able to power the entire economy without the use of euros or dollars. They can use as much RMB as they need. And this fits perfectly into the plans of China. Understand why Trump wants to punish BRICS for de-dollarizing. He wants to stop them from trading with China in local currencies. Russia and China have figured a way out of the dollar system. Now in 2024, Chinese-Russian trade hit a historic high of well over $230 billion or 1.74 trillion yuan. And we can expect that 100% of this trade is done either in rubles or the RMB, and more likely than not, it's using the Chinese currency. Russia ships oil to China and they invoice in RMB. China takes the oil, they use the energy and they transform it into finished goods, plastics for example. And they sell their products back to Moscow and they ask for RMB in return. There's no intermediate currency like the dollar even needed. And just like China, Russia is using their oil exports to de-dollarize the world. Putin has pledged to help internationalize the Chinese yuan, and it's happening today. Now, these are the biggest oil producers in the world. The US is the first, Russia is second, while Saudi Arabia is number 3. However, this chart is a little misleading in who really has the power in the export markets, and that's what matters. Saudi Arabia is the biggest exporter, followed by Russia. And when Russia sells oil to Japan, for example, they can demand Chinese RMB as payment. Japan, who has an energy crisis, will have to comply to get cheap oil. And how does Japan get the Chinese currency? More likely than not, they will dump their holdings of dollars to get more RMB to buy Russian crude. And this is happening on a global scale, especially with the BRICS countries. Now, this chart should keep Trump up at night. It tells us how Russia is helping to de-dollarize the world, and it is working. The black line shows Russian exports to China. Beijing will definitely settle most of them, if not all import payments using the yuan. And if we minus off this amount with Russia's total exports in yuan, we can see something rather interesting. Putin is getting other countries to use China's currency to buy Russian goods. It's around $4 billion monthly. Sounds small, but this amount will only continue to grow. This, of course, is a big problem for the United States. They need the world to stay in the dollar system to transact in dollars and buy treasury bonds. Why? Because the government just can't stop spending money. Let the reality sink in. By 2054, the US deficit will hit 8% of GDP, and this projection was done before Trump's trade war. And thanks to that, Trump will have to borrow even more money than ever before. Imposing tariffs won't be enough to reshore industries. He needs to give a ton of tax breaks and stimulus to entice companies to build in America. And that, ironically, is only going to push the debt up even higher. He can't afford for bond yields to rise. It will make his reshoring adventure even more expensive, something that the US economy just can't afford. Consider the backdrop we are in. The Federal Reserve isn't cutting rates fast enough. And thanks to its tariffs, inflation is also going to rebound. So the standard of living is dropping. Local Americans will be too broke to buy US bonds. The only people left will be foreigners. But that buying will only be supported if the dollar is the reserve currency. And global trade is a big piece of this puzzle. Understand the mindset of the new Trump administration. They are willing to do all it takes to defend the dollar system and reshore production. Just listen to JD Vance on the tariff war.
These tariffs will go into effect tomorrow.
Yep.
25% on Canada and Mexico, 10% on China. Are you expecting retaliation?
We'll see what happens, but I think, unfortunately, the retaliation has already happened. The problem with this whole idea that they're going to retaliate is they have already been taking advantage of America for decades. The retaliation is Donald Trump saying no more. We're not going to be taken advantage of anymore, and I think it's important the president is doing what he's doing. Now, look, it looks different ways and comes in different forms, whether you're talking about Canada or China or Mexico. We know the Chinese, of course, have stolen American manufacturing jobs for 30, 40 years. We are sick of being taken advantage of. We still have, thank God, the biggest economy in the entire world, the best people and the best workers. But the message from President Trump to the entire world is very clear. We are done being taken advantage of.
So this sets up the stage of complete decoupling between the US economy and the world. The US is willing to deindustrialize everyone on planet Earth for their benefit. The retaliation will go beyond just counter tariffs. Now, for sure, that's going to be on the table. Canada has already demonstrated that. But the biggest move will come from the world moving away from using dollars in trade. Trump's actions are only going to push the world closer to BRICS. And guess who are the biggest exporters in the bloc, selling stuff that everyone needs? China and Russia. And instead of USD, they will be demanding RMB for trade. So it's not a good day for the US economy. But let me know what you think. Will Putin seize every Western asset on Russian soil? And will the world dump more dollars for bilateral currency trade? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.